Hello everybody, welcome back to Inspirational Landscapes. Most of you will be watching this video as part of a bigger presentation within the Inspirational Landscapes module. And we're talking in this session about the idea of home. Before you watch this video though, I did ask you to take 5 minutes and just write down your own answers to these questions. First of all, just think about what the word, the idea, home means to you. Just jot down a few labels, a few words to describe the idea of home. And what are your components of home? If you were making a list of what makes up home, or what defines home, or what determines where you're going to call home, what would be your components that you put on that list? And thirdly, can you identify the boundary between the area, the space, place or location that you're going to call home in your definition, and whatever is outside of that, the rest of the world, the not home? What's the boundary? What's the line? What's the limit between those? So just do that, please, before you watch this video, and then move on through the rest of the resources. Now, we have encountered home in our previous sessions repeatedly. It's been a theme that's cropped up over and over again. But in this session, we're going to look at it just a little bit more specifically and dig into it in a little bit more detail. In our last session, for example, where we were looking at the catastrophe on Mount Everest, where lots of climbers got killed, and there was that little bit of video of a climber coming down off the mountain, and he was saying that he just wanted to get off the mountain and to go home, and there's this idea of returning to home as a place of safety, a place of security, somewhere that you're familiar with, different from Mount Everest in a storm, but different from the other, different from the wilderness. We also encountered it previously when talking about Proust, In Search of Lost Time, and I read you that extract about the traveller that he imagined from hearing the train punctuating the distance, now near, now further away. And he talked about the excitement that this traveller would be experiencing from a variety of things, including what he called the excitement induced by the happy prospect of being home again. Also, I think in that same session, we talked about Barry Lopez in his book Arctic Dreams, and he's talking about Yi Fu Tuan's idea that people set out from places where they feel a sense of attachment or shelter and comprehension, and they journey from these places into spaces, and the spaces are characterised by ideas like adventure or freedom and the unknown. So I'm wondering, well, is that difference between the places that we set out from and that we return to, and those spaces that we venture out into, is that going to have something to do with your definition between the home and the not home? Or is home, like I have my hat with me today, is home simply wherever you choose to lay your hat at the end of the day when you're travelling? Does home move with you as you move, particularly if you're on some kind of journey? Are you carrying your home with you? So what's your idea of home? That's what I asked you to think about before we started. Now, in those contexts that we've talked about before and that I've just mentioned now, for most people, those ways of thinking about home have positive connotations. There are ideas of safety, familiarity, comfort, maybe friends and family sharing that space with you, shared experience, a long experience of a place, of a location, builds up to generate perhaps this sense of home. Is there an element of how long you spent in a place, or how new a place is, that's going to make a difference to whether it feels home, like home or not? But consider, I'll put a link to the video up, or you can watch that video immediately after this, or you can pause me now and go and watch this video of the poem Go Home by the poet called George the Poet. And that poem, Go Home, gives an immigrant's perspective on that phrase, go home, and the kind of ideas that might have been coming into many of your minds over the last few minutes while I've been talking about home and the positive ideas that we might associate with home. Well, those are going to be very different from the kinds of ideas that George the Poet is talking about in his poem. It's a very negative use of that term, and it gives a very different set of connotations or associations from those that many of you will have initially maybe come up with as we started talking about it. So as we have said repeatedly, and we're going to keep saying throughout this module, basic geographical ideas or terms or views can mean very different things to different people depending on their perspective, their background, where they're coming from, what kind of time we're dealing with. So an idea such as home isn't a simple idea that means just one thing. It's going to mean different things in different contexts to different people. Now, associated with that idea of home, here's another question that I'd like you to think about. When we encounter and get to know a new place or an area, how does that actually happen? How does that work? What order do we get to know the place in? Do we, for example, do we just start at one location, our home base or our landing point, our starting point, and then gradually work out from there and discover new things, having an area of detail, an area of ignorance, then gradually expanding our area of detail into the area of ignorance? Does it work like that? Or do we start from one point perhaps and work along the line from landmark to new landmark to next landmark along a line, perhaps with excursions? You can almost think of it like a survey traverse exercise. We work our way through the landscape, encountering new things, and as with the first example, I guess, expanding our area of knowledge. Or maybe a whole different way of thinking about it would be to imagine that we have a general view of the whole area. Maybe we've looked at the map before we went, or we've seen a satellite image. We have a general view of the whole area. And then gradually that whole area, as we discover new things about it, as we explore it, it gradually all together comes into clearer and clearer focus as we see more and more detail of it. So is there a kind of trajectory through the area, or is there an aerial transition over the course of time? Or is it different in different circumstances, in different situations? Or if you're starting from home and you want to expand, how does that happen? And just as an analogy to try and explain what I'm getting at here, here are two paintings. One's by a friend of mine, Jane Burks, who does animal portraits, and you can see a partially completed painting by her here, where she's more or less completed, well, the eyes. She's completed one part in perfect detail, but the rest of the picture, as yet, is completely blank, completely unbegun. There's nothing there yet. So that kind of matches the earlier example, if you like, as to how you might explore an area by doing one bit in detail before then expanding and gradually doing more and more, but having big areas of totally unknown territory. This second picture is me doing one of my portraits of Gustav Mahler, and I've taken a very different approach. So I started with a rough outline, a rough overview, but I've basically filled the canvas or filled the board with paint before I get very far, and then working over the whole board all at once, not just doing an eye and then the other eye, then the nose and the lips, but doing everything, then doing a bit more of everything, then doing a little bit more of everything, then adding some detail to everything until eventually the whole picture emerges. Well, those are nice analogies, if you like, for different ways in which one might imagine exploring a landscape. How does that apply for you? And if you're thinking of there being a familiar home base and an unknown wilderness area, how would you explore that wilderness area? Which of those two analogies works best for you? Try transferring that idea to somewhere that you already know, or somewhere that you're exploring, maybe your hometown, or if you've relatively recently arrived at Kiel. How did you explore, how did you discover, how did you find out about the landscape around Kiel, or how did you discover the area around your hometown? Now try transferring that also away from a literal, actual landscape of houses and roads and countryside, and try thinking about a book or a film. To begin with, maybe think about a landscape within a book or a landscape within a film, and think about how that has been presented to you by the author or by the filmmaker. Necessarily, I guess, if you're watching a film from beginning to end, or you're reading a book from beginning to end, so things are presented in sequence to you in a sense. But do you gradually get an overall impression of the landscape thickening up over time through the book or through the film? Or do you literally know one spot, then the next spot, then the next spot, then the next spot, and build up a sequence of detail? How does that work? Maybe think about that next time you're reading, or go and find one of your favourite books or films and look at how the landscape emerges for you as you're watching the film. And is it the same as real life, or does it work differently for a book or in a book or in a film? And what about if you've got a favourite book or a favourite film and you go back to it over time? Like I've been talking about Proust, I keep going back to Proust over the years and dipping in here and there and looking at things. So over the course of a very long time period, I re-encounter bits of the book. And I'm thinking now not so much just of landscapes described within the book, but I'm thinking of the book itself, this massive long book that I've encountered over many years or decades. Is my gradually getting to know that book, first of all by reading through it, then by going back and dipping in, then by looking at my favourite bits, and then looking up a few things, looking up a few moments in the book now to talk to you about in these sessions. Does my discovery and engagement with that book, my exploration of that book, match in some way the way that we might explore an actual landscape? So can I think about the book as a landscape, because the way that I'm exploring and discovering the book is the same as, or can be equated in some way with the ways in which I might explore and discover a real landscape. And certainly, I'm not looking in the book right now, so my idea of the book, or of landscapes from within the book, their idea is very much in my memory. Likewise, I'm not at Kiel right now, so if I think of Kiel, or if I think of Greenland, or if I think of Ecuador, or if I think of Birmingham, I'm remembering that landscape. Well, is that remembering of a real landscape any different from my remembering of the fictional landscape? Most landscapes, most of the time, are in our memory, not in real life. So what's the difference between real and fictional in that sense? And if we're thinking today specifically about home, well, are there bits in a film or in a book that somehow feel like home? Like if I refer you to a section in your favourite book, are there favourite bits in it? Oh, I like that bit. Oh yeah, I enjoy rereading that bit. I feel comfortable reading. But that chapter, I didn't really like that, or I didn't really enjoy it. That didn't feel comfortable there so much. If I had to watch a bit of that film again, I'd watch the second half, but I didn't like that first half because. So do you feel at home in parts of a book in the same way that you feel at home in parts of a landscape? So could we divide a book up in the same way as we divide a landscape up? Are there places within a book, locations, spots? I suppose if you're doing it on a Kindle, then there are literally locations. Go to location 27. And are there spaces or areas within a book? Can we think of a book as a physical landscape that we navigate our way around, dividing it into those sections, as well as thinking about the landscapes that are actually being described in the book? So before we move on, just take on board what we've been talking about just now, have a think, and think again about your definition of home, its components and its boundaries, those few things that I asked you to think about before we started this video. And then head back to the bigger presentation of which this video is a part. So for those of you doing this as a part of the module at Kiel, go back to the sway that this video is embedded within, and we'll move on thinking again about what home is and how we might envisage ourselves at home in different situations.